Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. And today we're privileged to have Dr. Paul Coulter speaking to us on the art of healthcare. The idea that medicine is an art runs from the thought of Aristotle through the Hippocratic Oath into modern times, but there is a lot of confusion over what the art of healthcare is and how it relates to scientific knowledge. And this is much more than simply a theoretical issue. It makes a real difference to how we think of our patients, our relationships with them, the nature of health, and the shape of excellent care. And this webinar is going to consider some deficient understandings of the art of healthcare, and will propose an integrative understanding that is thoroughly evidence-based, but more than merely scientific. Our speaker today is Dr. Paul Coulter. Having worked as a junior doctor, Paul moved into pastoral ministry and studied pastoral theology to PhD level. And his commitment to disciple and train Christian servants led him into lecturing in practical theology and then into his current role as head of ministry operations with Living Leadership, developing a network of people helping leaders live joyfully and serve faithfully in Christ. His passion for ethics, apologetics, and evangelism undergirds his voluntary role as executive director of the care of the Center for Christianity in Society, which connects Christ with contemporary culture. Paul lives in Northern Ireland with his wife Garling and their two teenage children. So Paul, we're delighted you can join us today and really looking forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you again, Peter, for the invitation and for the welcome. I'm just going to share my screen so that we make sure I've got it right. Great. So it is good to be with you. It's good to be speaking about this theme. And as you've heard from Peter, I haven't practiced medicine for many years. I have, however, stayed involved with the Christian Medical Fellowship here in the UK. And my wife is an elderly care physician. And I've had various other involvements in the healthcare system here in Northern Ireland. So clearly you don't study medicine and then work in medicine and forget everything or stop caring about those who are working in medicine. But I hope what I'm going to share will be useful for you. I hope it's also useful for healthcare professionals of all kinds. But obviously, having trained in medicine myself, I'll think of this primarily as a doctor. And I think as we begin, it's really hard for us to imagine and really to comprehend what it was like for people in past centuries practicing healthcare. In our age of modern scientific medicine, that's a bit foreign for us. And I should say, sorry, as I begin, just that this talk is based on a chapter from a book that I published with Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK earlier this year. So if you want to follow that up, that is available from CMF, but that's the shameless plug over. So I remember when I was at school in my GCSE exams, which are the state exams that we do around the age of 16, that we studied a module in history called the History of Medicine. And my teenage self was fascinated by some of what I heard. Things like the Greek humoral theory, the idea of the four humors and their balance in the body as being the idea behind health, or the idea of spontaneous generation of life. Sorry, forgive me, the slides are a little bit tricky. People thought that life could spontaneously generate if you had the right circumstances in the age before Pasteur and others. They said, well, if you can get mice in a closed barn, then that explains that life just spontaneously generates when you have the right ingredients. And I think probably I was most intrigued by the stories of hasty amputations in the pre-anesthetic age and some of the unintended consequences of those. So when we think about all of that, I think we can be immensely thankful for modern scientific medicine. It has brought us many blessings. It's given us remarkable advances in physical health and in longevity. And of course, it promises to offer a lot more in the future. And there's no conflict between confidence as modern healthcare professionals in science as a tool for discovering truth about the physical world, including the human body. That's not a conflict with our Christian faith. In fact, I would say that fits perfectly with the Christian worldview, because we believe that our intelligent, and wise God created all things. So we expect order and purpose in the world. And because we are created in his image, we expect to be able to discover these truths, to understand them, and to apply them for good. And I think with that in mind, it's no coincidence that it was in Europe where Christianity had given such beliefs to our culture that modern science developed. So Christian healthcare professionals can be and should be committed to what we call evidence-based medicine, which Sackett and all describe as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. And they go on to explain that current best evidence means the consensus amongst medical scientists about evidence gathered through experiments using the scientific method. And of course, the scientific method, just to remind us, is the idea that we can make a hypothesis and we can test that by experimentation and observation. We can revise it depending on the results. So put very simply, if we're going to put something into someone's body or take something out, we want to make sure that what we're doing is going to benefit them rather than harm them. And science has proven hugely useful in answering that question. But at the same time, we do need to recognize some of the limits of scientific medicine. We could question the quality of our evidence. We recognize that scientific theories inevitably entail interpretation. Recent news stories about the evidence or questioning the evidence behind received wisdom, for example, about the cause of Alzheimer's disease or the role of serotonin in depression, should remind us that we need to think critically, and we always need to keep on developing our understanding. But when you think about that, science depends on a commitment to the truth. But fallen human beings are driven by other interests as well, personal fame, commercial interests. And so there's always a risk that we favor our preferred interpretation. We bury inconvenient results, we distort their findings. And all of that is to say that science needs ethics to guide it, which I'll come back to. But the merits and potential pitfalls of science are not really what I want to focus on in this webinar. What I want to do is to think about this idea of the art of healthcare. And I'm going to suggest that it's something that our forebears, despite all of their ignorance about biochemistry and physiology, mechanisms of disease and healing, they may have understood this much better than we do in the modern age. Now, you, like me, maybe were asked the question or may remember that question when you were in medical school or in training. I do remember the question being asked, is medicine an art or a science? Sadly, I can't actually remember the answer to the question. And I think that's probably because there wasn't really much of an answer that was given. After all, there was so much to learn in those early medical sciences of anatomy, biochemistry, physiology in the first couple of years. And there were distinctions to be won in those. There were awards to be earned in other disciplines like microbiology. And clinical exams later on in my studies did give some attention to bedside manner, to communication skills. But actually, the impression was very much that science, or medicine is science, and the application of science. So I don't think it's unfair if I say that there wasn't a lot of attention in my studies to deeper questions like why we should care for people and what the persons we care for actually are. Worldview was left out of the equation, or perhaps I should say there was a kind of assumption that things were basically physical. Materialism was implicit, the idea that matter is all that there is. And so whether that reflected the fact that there was a lack of an agreed worldview amongst the people who were educating us, or that there was just so much information to be conveyed, the fact is that I don't think these things were handled well. Now, that might have been better in your experience. Maybe it's improved over the 20 years or so since I graduated. But I think there is still this question of confusion about what the art of healthcare is. And that term, of course, is a long pedigree, as Peter mentioned in his introduction. There is the Hippocratic Oath in its classic version. It describes medicine as an art. It says, I will reverence my master who taught me the art. I will teach my art to others. Now, you may be familiar in 1964, a clinical pharmacologist called Lasagna, composed a new version of the Oath. It was meant to be more suitable for modern scientific medicine. And that has gained quite a bit of influence in medical schools. And it leads with a pledge to respect the hard-won scientific gains of those physicians in whose steps I walk, protecting scientific gains. And he writes, I will remember that there is an art to medicine as well as science. So the change from the classic Hippocratic Oath, where medicine in its totality is an art, to Lasagna's oath, where the art is an add-on to the science, is quite remarkable. So what is the art of medicine or the art of healthcare? That's one question that faces us. And then a second question, how does it relate to science? So in the rest of the talk, what I want to do is consider four possibilities, three that I think are one that I think is deficient, utterly deficient, and then a couple that I think are building towards a better understanding, and then to present the one that I think is best. So one option would be that the art of medicine is something out of date. It's been excluded by science. We used to think of medicine as an art because we didn't really know what we were doing. Now that we've got science, we know what we're doing. There is no artistry around it any longer. And that view rests on an idea, maybe that materialism that I mentioned, matter is everything, and what we might call scientism, which is the idea that science alone can be the pathway to discovering truth. It comes across in, for example, the writings of Stephen Novella online. He says that science-based medicine not only works, it is necessary if we are to have any effective regulations and standards of care. Introducing philosophical and religious beliefs into medicine goes hand in hand with eroding the standard of care and failing to protect the public from false or misleading claims and unsafe or ineffective practices. Now, just look at that quotation for a moment. The first sentence, I think, should be unproblematic for us. It's uncontroversial. We can benefit from science and the application of science. We want to have effective regulations and standards. But what he says in the second sentence is problematic. He says we should get rid of philosophical and religious beliefs. And I want to say that I think that is problematic for two reasons. One, because it's not possible, and two, because it's not desirable. It's impossible to exclude philosophical beliefs from the practice of medicine because medicine is an activity undertaken by human people for human people. And so when we make even a claim like that medicine is strictly scientific, well, that's a philosophical claim. It reflects a materialistic worldview in which only the physical exists. And anyone who wants to make use of science does so because they have a philosophical conviction that we can know truth and that we can know it with some certainty. And the other thing, of course, that's problematic is that we need an ethical framework, as I said earlier, for healthcare. And science simply can't provide that. Why should a trained professional who has superior knowledge not override the patient's wishes? Why should healthcare professionals act in the best interest of individual patients rather than for the good of whole populations or indeed for their own personal gain? What should a healthcare professional do when they're faced with a choice between extending the length of life and preserving quality of life? Such ethical questions are not answered by science, and yet they're essential for individualized medical care. Science cannot provide us with ethical standards. It's impossible to exclude philosophy and, of course, religion along with it from the practice of medicine, but it's also not desirable. Let me explain why that is. Because it neglects the fact that our patients are people who have values and beliefs. It neglects the fact that when they think about their health, they are thinking from a religious or philosophical perspective, whether they've thought it through in detail, whether that's coherent or not. And there's a growing body of evidence that says that philosophical and religious convictions are actually very important for patients' well-being. What patients believe impacts their health, not only subjectively, in that they might feel better about their health if they have religious beliefs, but objectively. The Handbook of Religion and Health has gathered together the evidence about the health benefits of religion and of faith. And one reviewer describes the findings like this: most studies have shown that religious involvement and spirituality are associated with better health outcomes, including greater longevity, coping skills, and healthy quality of life, even during terminal illness, and less anxiety, depression, and suicide. Several studies have shown that addressing the spiritual needs of the patient may enhance recovery from illness. So if we try to exclude religious and philosophical ideas from healthcare altogether, we really aren't serving our patients well. And yet that reductionistic approach, that medicine is science and nothing more, can creep into our practice of healthcare. I think especially in specialties where we have less direct interaction with patients, or at least patients who are awake, and specialties that are more technical. But if we reject the materialistic view of the world, as Christians must, or at least if we accept that it's not the only way to think about ultimate reality, as any humble scientist should, then we've got to leave space for the art of healthcare. But what is the art of healthcare if that's the case? Well, clearly it's not art in the sense of the common usage of the word, which is, as Oxford Languages put it, the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form like a painting or a sculpture, producing works to be appreciated for beauty or emotional power. That doesn't really explain the art of healthcare. It's something more than that. And if you scroll down Oxford Languages definition, you'll find in fourth place is this: a skill at doing something, typically one acquired through practice. In the English language, at least, we talk about the practice of medicine. There is a skill to be developed. And so the art of medicine is a way of caring for people that goes beyond what is merely scientific. So let's think about three ways that we could approach that. And the first of them is thinking of the art of healthcare as wisdom, applying science. So in this way of thinking, the art is conceptually secondary and subsequent to the science of medicine. So the Lasagna oath that I mentioned earlier seemed to indicate that. The idea is that modern medicine at its core is scientific, but we take our knowledge from science, and the art is applying that knowledge to specific patients. One advocate of this view is a physician called John Saunders. There's always a Saunders in there somewhere. And he writes that although doctors' medical practice is not itself science, it is based on science and on training that is supposed to teach doctors to apply scientific knowledge to people in a rational way. And Saunders also quotes approvingly this statement from Clark Glymore and Douglas Stalker: medical practice depends on generalizations that can be reliably applied and scientifically demonstrated. Without understanding people as objects in this way, there can be no such thing as medical science. Now, the mention of the word object, I'm sure, rings a slight warning bell, doesn't it? We can't objectify our patients. And of course, advocates of this view would say, I'm sure, that's not what they intend to do. What they are afraid of is that clinical judgment can be clouded by non-scientific factors to the detriment of patients. So at some level, they say you have to think of the patient as an object. Saunders expresses it like this. He says, in its methodology, scientific thinking must be insulated from all kinds of psychological, sociological, economic, political, moral, and ideological factors which tend to influence thought in life and society. Without those proscriptions, objective knowledge of truth will denigrate into prejudice and ideology. Now, of course, the idea of objective scientific knowledge, unpolluted by contaminants, might sound attractive to us. Who wouldn't want to come home at night from the ward or the clinic and be able to say they did nothing but apply science in a vacuum? But experience tells us it's a myth. It comes dangerously close to the scientism that we saw with Novella that excluded the art of medicine. Close, but not quite, because Saunders continues to describe the art of medicine. And he describes it as when a physician applies the findings of medical science to a patient with their individual preferences and wishes in their distinct combination of diseases, so they receive a certain combination of therapies in a specific social setting. In other words, he is open to these other factors, but still he's thinking the science itself is pure and it just gets injected into that context. So central to this idea is the thought that the art is sound judgment about what is right for the patient. And Saunders concludes his article saying the art of caring for patients should flourish not merely in the theoretical or abstract grey zones where scientific evidence is incomplete or conflicting, but also in the recognition that what is black and white in the abstract often becomes grey in practice as clinicians seek to meet their patients' needs. But still, the art of medicine is the application of science. And yet that doesn't seem to quite do justice to the bedside manner that, of course, is so beloved by patients from good healthcare professionals. I think there's still something missing from what Saunders has said. So let's think about a second way of thinking of the art of healthcare, and this is as relationship, knowing people. Now, thinking about it this way doesn't leave behind wisdom. It's additive to it. But it recognizes that the thing that the knowledge is applied to is more than an object. The patient and the professional are both subjects. The patient has his own knowledge and values, and he must trust the professional if he's going to cooperate with the treatment plan. So indeed, as the placebo effect shows, trust in an intervention is a vital element in its efficacy, whatever the scientific evidence. And trust is inseparable from how a patient feels about the person proposing the intervention. The art of medicine includes what we would call the therapeutic relationship. And Lasagna's Oath takes this view of the art of medicine. It says, I will remember there is an art to medicine as well as science, that warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. Behavioral scientist Thomas Agnew describes the art of medicine as interpersonal aspects of the healing process or enterprise. And Professor of Community Medicine Satyajit Charan Panda similarly writes, the art of medicine is the strong foundation of practice. Its thrust is to allay anxiety in the minds of patients and to console them under all circumstances. Compassion and understanding are a large part of this art. So Panda argues that medical education shouldn't be merely about imparting knowledge that's to be applied, but the forming of persons with character and values to relate well to people. And that's the bit that I fear was missing in my medical education. So this perspective, the art of medicine as relationship, helps us to see patients not as problems to be solved, but as people to be served. It requires ability to acquire knowledge that doesn't just come through science. As Norwegian researcher Christine Barrow suggests, healthcare professionals seek knowledge along two axes. They relate to nature in terms of seeking to identify and explain features of the body, and at the same time, they seek to understand human products of meaning, interpreting and explaining communication, reactions, and actions. Relationship really matters. Some medical educationalists, again, others like lecturers in general practice, Blair Smith and Ross Tyler, argue that the humanities should be included in medical education. so that we engage with the great literature of the world, and that can enhance doctors' ability to empathize, to practice storytelling, to teach their students about illness, and to enhance their own leisure time and sustain them in practice. Now, of course, the challenge here is, well, how do we resolve tensions that arise between what science seems to be telling us and the patient's experience? Andrew Warsop, a general practitioner who also favors this approach, says that the art of medicine is essentially composed of the clinical skills of listening and advocacy brought to bear in the consultation. It's a special kind of technique. That's the Greek word, going back to Aristotle, that gets translated as art. That's distinguished from an existential focus directed to and caring for the patient's life experience in such a way that science can be applied therapeutically. Warsop raises an important question. What is it that we're listening for when we take a history from a patient? Because if we don't understand the patient well, we can't hope to advocate for her in what are truly her best interests. Nor can we forge a relationship of trust. And importantly, too, we can't gather properly informed consent if we communicate information about the risks without thinking of the person. Rabbi, family therapist Edwin Friedman writes, the focus on data to the exclusion of emotional variables leaves the patient only to hope that he or she falls into the right category. This atmosphere not only turns patients into statistics, ultimately it turns them into data. So we have to know our patients well, including their coping mechanisms, and that will allow us to individualize their risk profile and the best course of action for them. More importantly as well, through that trusting relationship, we can actually build our patients' resilience. So the art of healthcare is relationship is clearly an improvement on thinking of it only as the application of science. But it still suggests that the two things are distinct. We have scientific knowledge, and then we have relationship. But the third way that we can think about this, which I think comes closer to a Christian approach, is integration. The art of medicine is integration. In one sense, I'm making an appeal to go back to the original Hippocratic Oath, to say that the whole of healthcare is an art. It's not that the art is one part of what we do. And I'm saying that knowledge to be integrated in the art of healthcare doesn't only come from science or only from relationship with the patient. Biomedical scientific knowledge is vital for safe and effective healthcare, but it's not adequate alone. So what must be integrated with it? Well, I find Christine Barrow's definition of the art of medicine helpful here. She says, exercising medicine as an art requires interpretive capacities which are called for in the translation of general scientific biomedical knowledge into particular cases, in acting as moral agents in encounters with patients, in establishing non-biomedical knowledge with relevance for providing adequate care, and in the overall activity of combining all of these elements, including biomedical science, in the practice of medicine. I think she's right. It's the overall activity of integrating. At least 4 elements. You might be able to add more. Biomedical knowledge from the natural sciences, yes. Knowledge of human nature from the social sciences and humanities. Practical wisdom to apply knowledge from both sources to a specific patient, and compassionate and ethical. Notice she mentioned moral as well. Compassionate and ethical relationship with the patient in his needs and values. And note that final point really comes only from the patient himself. He's the source of that knowledge, and we need to understand his beliefs and his values. And that includes understanding what he believes about ultimate reality. What is a good life for him? What are his life goals? Why does he believe life matters? We shouldn't neglect that, because patients do better clinically when they're motivated to recover. And if the actions we take are coherent with their values, then those actions will be followed by them more consistently and have more benefit. So in short, it's not only that we can't eliminate philosophy and religion from the art of healthcare, we must not do so. In fact, we've got to engage with our patients' beliefs and values. We've got to listen well and seek understanding. We've got to work with them for their well-being. Healthcare professionals can't be practical scientists alone. They must be artists. Each treatment plan is a work of art, as is each patient a work of art of her creator. Now, of course, that raises lots of questions. What do we do when we see that a patient's beliefs are incoherent with what we believe or clearly detrimental to their health? On one hand, we mustn't enforce our own beliefs on a patient. On the other, the nature of a trusting relationship means that we shouldn't be dishonest by pretending that we share their beliefs. And in a trusting relationship, we can share about our own beliefs, about ultimate reality. And we can do so with confidence, knowing that a truly Christian worldview will never be detrimental to a patient's health. Although I better stop there. There may be questions that follow that on, but that's in a sense another subject, which is how we define health in all of its dimensions. But let me close just by giving you my definition of my working definition of the art of healthcare. As often with these things, it keeps being reviewed. It's not even quite what I wrote in the book. But the art of healthcare, I think, is the whole practice of healthcare in which a practitioner wisely applies knowledge of the best available scientific research and knowledge of human nature derived from social sciences, philosophy, and the humanities to the specific health needs of a unique patient in a way that coheres with the patient's worldview and the practitioner's ethical commitments within a compassionate, trusting, therapeutic relationship. You'll be very glad that the slides will be circulated later, because I'm sure you'll need to read over that again. But the art of medicine integrates scientific knowledge, sociological insights, wise judgment, strong interpersonal skills, and understanding of the whole person of the patient, which of course is another reason that it takes a team, a multidisciplinary team. It's another reason too that medical practitioners must keep sharpening those skills and keep remembering what it might be that they're tempted to neglect. Peter, back to you.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that incredibly comprehensive overview of the art of medicine. Well, Paul, you finished off talking about the need for multidisciplinary teams and the fact that not all of us can bring everything that every patient needs. And a question here from Alison Herbert, first of all, who's saying, as a nurse, she says, it may be a little easier to practice the art of nursing as we spend more time with the patients, and nursing of the sick was undertaken by nuns in the local community historically. Would you agree with this? Or do you believe that nursing is also losing its idea of nursing as an art and is heading towards just scientific evidence-based practice? There's a tricky question.
Can I plead the Fifth Amendment, Peter? I know nothing of the ways of nursing. No, I do think, and again, some of what I'll say is highly anecdotal. It's based on individuals or observations, either my own or what I've heard from others. But yes, I think at the heart of nursing, as it has historically developed, that closeness to patients, that constant watch is hugely valuable, and wise doctors lean very heavily on that. I mean, I can remember instances where getting bleeped by the nurses to say Mrs. So-and-so's really not herself, and I couldn't find anything objectively wrong with my examination skills, and said, look, I can't find anything, and half an hour later you get an urgent bleep to say she's peri-arrest or whatever. I mean, that observational ability, that knowledge of the patient and their norms is immensely valuable. I do fear that that is undermined a little bit in nursing. I think certainly in the UK, the drive towards degree-based training carries that risk with it. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's good that nurses are gaining additional skill and knowledge, but the risk is that those relational skills, those observational skills, that time with the patient becomes more pressurized. And the bad habits of doctors might bleed over into nursing as well. So yeah, I think it's an interesting observation, but I think what we all need to do, whatever our role is to think, okay, how do I improve in this? How do I lean on others where I recognize a weakness in myself? How do I take a more holistic view and a more integrative view of healthcare?
Thanks. Shari Falkenheimer is asking, with the increasing level of burnout, even among Christian healthcare professionals, what practical ways can they use to keep their compassion and caring approach to their patients? We can rely on the Holy Spirit, but what can not yet believers do to maintain the compassion? It's important.
Well, I mean, I think this is a huge issue for medicine certainly in my part of the world, in Western Europe. I really do fear, because the assumption tends to be, I think, that people go into medicine because they care about people, so they kind of want to do something good for people, and that might be true when somebody goes into medical school. But once you get exposed to the pressures of the system, once you start to feel like a very small cog in a very big machine, that sort of naive, positive thinking about doing something good doesn't really carry you through a lifetime in healthcare. And I think the things that therefore replace it are financial drivers, self-protection, kind of self-progress. So I do worry about that. I think there's insufficient attention. And of course, the Christian worldview, Christian faith, provides excellent motivation for medicine, as well as a good ethical framework. So I think as Christian healthcare professionals, we need to remind ourselves of that. We need to go back to the great physician, if I can call the Lord Jesus that, the one who, you know, if you see how he approaches people, it is truly integrative, it's truly relational. He's aware of physical need, but also every other dimension. I think we can learn a lot from him. I think we need to work hard to stay embedded in Christian communities, in churches. We need to ask those folks to be praying for us. During the COVID pandemic, certainly there was a lot of praying for frontline workers, as they were called. I, as somebody in Christian ministry, sometimes thought, am I not a frontline worker too? So I have to confess I was a little bit jealous of my wife, but actually it was good. They really needed it, but you need that prayer all the time. And you need fellowship with other Christian healthcare professionals through your local mechanisms for that. So we do need to stay close to the Lord. We need to be refreshed in his word and in prayer by the Spirit. We need one another. I think for non-Christians, I find it much harder to say what would be the thing that would sustain them. So maybe the best thing we could do for them is to share the gospel with them, to introduce them to Jesus. But maybe we could also spark more of a conversation about that with our own colleagues, but also in the professions as a whole. Because I think the profession does need to wrestle with those worldview questions. So worldview tends to be the unseen water that we swim in. People just make assumptions, but assumptions are dangerous. And they're dangerous if you're going into a profession where people's lives are in your hands. So I think wider questions in medical education, in bringing those questions into our continued professional development, not simply how do we keep up to date with the latest scientific evidence, but why do we do this and how do we keep going? I mean, there are basic creation things that we can do to help that work for everybody: getting enough sleep, exercising, keeping a healthy body weight, enough sunlight, whether that's to do with serotonin or not, but these things are good for us. That works for everyone. But I think there needs to be a deeper conviction, a vocation. And if there isn't anybody to do the calling, it's very hard to see how you can have a calling, isn't it? So ultimately, I think faith in God, trust in him is what motivates us.
Thank you, Paul. There's an anonymous question here. Thank you for your very stimulating presentation, including the Stephen Novella quote, which is shocking in its optimism about what, by its very nature, reductionist science can achieve, although representative of an un or ahistorical dominant view in Western society. And then the question, would you agree that we can confidently claim that especially the Christian faith has always driven exploration, improved understanding of the cosmos, including the progress of science, and that good healthcare cannot but be motivated by charity, outgoing, caring, sharing love for one's own neighbor? You've given some historical reflections already, but
Sure.
a bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly that last point, I think, ties into what I was saying in response to the last question, that there has to be a sense of vocation. There has to be an other focused dimension, doesn't there? If you're not in this more for the benefit of your patient than for your own benefit, there's a problem. And where does that motivation or where does that value come from? So certainly that's a gospel value. It's not to say that nobody else can be altruistic. I think woven into part of how God has created us and not completely eliminated by the fall is the potential for altruism. It's a very human thing. It's part of how God has made us. But whether that's enough to sustain somebody and whether that's enough to keep both individuals and the profession as a whole on a clear, straight path, I think is very questionable. And that question of ethics, if I go back to that, I mean, why is it good science depends on truth telling. You've got to report your findings accurately. You've got to interpret them fairly. So truth telling, fairness, humility to admit that you might be wrong. Well, these are all Christian virtues, aren't they? It's no surprise that Christians should make excellent scientists. No surprise that science was birthed, modern science in Europe, that those ways of approaching truth, and of course behind that the conviction that the world will be orderly and that we can understand it, that we have minds that can discover that and apply it. All of that fits with a Christian worldview. Again, not to say that non-Christians can't be good scientists, but it probably shouldn't shock us when we see commercial interest of big pharma burying some results, and that happens a lot. We need to be much more open about the negative results as well as the positive ones in drug trials, or that individuals will distort, at best have a biased interpretation, or at worst, frankly, manipulate statistics, because that's how you get your paper published. That's how you get your whatever award it is, right up to your Nobel Prize. So there has to be, I think that's why worldview questions matter, and it's why Christians have so much to offer in those spaces. So I'm not trying to say only Christians can do that well, but as Christians, we ought to care about that and be exemplary. And I think that could be a basis for us, even in evangelism with our colleagues, to say, let me tell you why I'm into this whole thing. It should also affect the way we speak, shouldn't it? Going back to the previous question, if we find ourselves in a culture of grumbling, which often comes in every workplace and not least in healthcare, because there's a lot to grumble about: limited resources, long waiting lists, difficult patients, difficult colleagues, long working hours. But if we are people who do everything with thankfulness, and whatever we do in word and deed, as Colossians 3 says, we do it in the name of the Lord Jesus, we'll speak differently. It's not to say we can never talk about the problems, but we'll talk about them in a different way. And so I think it shapes how we talk, it shapes how we act as well.
Thanks, Paul. Some people are making comments. Hugh Morgan has reminded us about the Ministry of Prime, Partnerships in International Medical Education, which exists specifically to teach the truths that Paul has been outlining. And Hugh has put a URL in the chat there. You might like to check that out. We know that education, medical education, differs across cultures and across countries. And there's an interesting comment here from Stephen Mahudia from an East African context, where he's saying, as medical students, the art was greatly emphasized. And the example of William Osler was given as one who emphasized the art of medicine. And I suspect that some of us were trained in medical schools which had a much more materialistic or a scientism presuppositional framework, if you like, and others where in different worldview contexts where the art of medicine was more emphasized. But Ruth Jahonga is asking here, how can a Christian doctor develop good interpersonal skills when they might not be explicitly taught or perhaps even modeled in the medical education that they're having?
That's an excellent question, Peter, and you may have a better answer than I do, so feel free to chip in on that. But I mean, I think there are things we can do. I mean, the fact is God makes us all differently as well, doesn't he? So some of us, these things come more naturally, what people will call emotional intelligence. And there is, of course, another risk with that. I mean, I should say that the counterbalance to being emotionally connected with our patients is that that can be overwhelming. You know, and in fact, I've been intrigued in the last few years. There's some psychology research that is questioning the whole idea of empathy. I think I may have mentioned the word empathy in my talk, but this idea that we can empathize with people really is a bit of a myth. I can say I can imagine how you might be feeling, but I can never actually say I know how you're feeling. God doesn't give us that connection with another person. Only he has that. And I think that does mean that as Christians, we can pray for insight. I think the Spirit can give us some understanding of people that even goes beyond what we hear and see, and we should pray for our patients. But listening well is the key thing. Being able to take the time, even if that's a relatively short time in a busy day, to actually just stop and listen and to show people that we're listening. The right body posture can help with that. You'll find it online, solar, that you sit in a particular way, give eye contact and so on. Making sure that we've heard things well, asking people, summarizing, all of that allows us to listen well to them, noticing what is there between the words, really all of which I think another dimension of what I'm talking about here is I suppose that we all need to remember to stay generalists or generalist enough that we can see how things fit together. So this is another challenge in modern medicine, the increasing specialization. The risk is that we lose sight of the whole. So just carving out a little bit more time to listen, showing that we're listening. Those are key things, and we can practice those with others. There are training opportunities, I'm sure, that will help. But I think prayerfully getting alongside people, if we're doing that outside our workplace, if we're doing that in the church, small groups, for example, can be a really good, safe place to I'm not saying you use those as a way to practice it, but we're learning to listen well and to share well with others as well. So, but leaning on other colleagues who maybe are stronger and asking them, how do you do that? Not being afraid to say, look, I notice you're brilliant at this. I struggle. Tell me how you do it. Give me a tip. And then starting to try that out and see how it works for you. But Peter, maybe you have other ideas on that. I mean, you're bound to have faced that question before.
I think I've been out of clinical medicine even longer than you, Paul. So
that's all right. We get to sit here and claim
any wisdom. And you talked about the importance of small groups. Alison Herbert's made the comment here that she says, I found joining in with the monthly Oceania prayer meeting, ICMDA prayer meeting, while working on a small Pacific island was really useful in staying connected with other Christian medics and the importance of bearing one another's burdens and encouraging one another. You mentioned before earlier in your talk about the situation where there is a clash of worldviews, if you like, between patient and doctor. And you said sometimes patients may have a worldview which we don't agree with, but at other times they may have a worldview which leads them to behaviors were actually positively harmful to their health and may be impacting on it, and not to address those is in a sense negligent. But Jean Rudd is asking the question here, when the patient's metaphysical view does not match the view of a Christian healthcare professional, how might that healthcare professional introduce the gospel without taking advantage of the power differential in the relationship?
Again, I think that's a very good question, and you know, I'm sure ICMDA, I know CMF in the UK. I think Peter, you would have been very much chief amongst that, does some training and helping professionals know how to share their faith. I think it's absolutely right, that last part about the power differential is vitally important to remember. So we don't want to be abusive, manipulative. The ideal, of course, is if a patient asks us, "What do you think, doctor? How do you see these things?" That would be helpful because that's a response to their question. One thing that I suggest in the book, and that I think, what I'm really getting at, is when we take a history from a patient, it ought not be that we're thinking, should I, shouldn't I ask about their worldview, their values, their beliefs, their faith. That ought to be standard. It ought to be, because how else can I build a trusting relationship with them? How else can I work with their beliefs where those beliefs are positive and helpful? How else might I or someone else in the team challenge those beliefs? And so the idea that that should be excluded from the history, excluded from our practice, I think is very wrong. It's very bad. I think when it comes to challenging that, we in that professional setting, we need to stay on the side of explaining and saying, but not being coercive or manipulative, never threatening. In other words, making sure that it's clear to the patient that whatever they believe, we will give them our very best attention, our best skill. But where we can see that a belief is actually getting in the way of their physical health, we spell it out for them, we explain that to them. But it's not necessarily ours to say, therefore, that belief is wrong. What we can do is to say, that's not the only way to see this. And you, as the patient, in other words, needs to decide if that is so integral to their belief and their being that they want to stick with it, or whether it's open to review. And then if the patient asks, well, what are the alternatives, or what do you believe? I can say honestly, in that trusting relationship, well, I'm a Christian, here's how I understand things. But I'm much more interested in that. That's not simply in the, therefore, here is the answer to your specific ethical dilemma or, treatment option. Actually, trying to explain how that frames everything. So telling a patient, I pray for my patients. I hope you understand that. I pray for them. I'm a Christian. I believe that God cares for you. And I'm talking, very few people will object to that, to the idea that someone's praying for them, even if they don't believe in the person you're praying to. So there are things we can do to indicate that, to bring that conversation around, but starting from the premise that we ought to treat people as people with beliefs, values, some motivation for living, whether we think that's good or not. And we need to work with that motivation for their well-being, as well as at times challenging ideas that are harmful. I think that's become difficult. Again, I can only really speak in the West because of all sorts of assumptions about secularization, that we should leave those things out of healthcare practice or out of public life. And yet there are still areas where we will do that. We will put policies in place that are against consanguinity, that people shouldn't marry too closely because of the healthcare implications. We will about female genital mutilation and so on. So we still know that there are some things that are just wrong and harmful. But the question becomes, how do we persuade people of that? And of course, in the whole, I think particularly when we're thinking about life and death, we owe it to our patients to help them to prepare well for death, even if we think the way they're preparing isn't the right way. In other words, to pretend that isn't the question, it's bound to be in their mind. So to leave that out of the equation is not actually treating them holistically and well. So that's where I have benefited from working in palliative care and seeing how that's done. I think we can still learn a lot from that, ideas of total pain, of holistic integral care as well. And maybe the palliative physicians can be our tutors in at least some of that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just a few more comments here that are coming in. Shari Falkenheimer's just saying, in addition to Prime's whole person medicine training, the USA CMDA has an online course called Faith Prescriptions, which is an expanded version of the Saline Solution course on sharing faith with beliefs with patients. So do check that out, Faith Prescriptions, on the CMDA US website. Paul Hudson's making the comment, listening well is important, but telling well, using words is so important. So many times the question of why me is central. The narrative of the gospel really is our opportunity to truly bring holism. So I guess that's about addressing questions of meaning and purpose, which is so often there under the surface and not addressed. And there's another anonymous remark here of someone who reads Triple Helix, which is exciting. Even back in 2001, when I think I was editing it back then, and the comment is, I found the book The Human Effect in Medicine by Dixon and Sweeney, which was favorably reviewed in Triple Helix in 2001, with the comment that something lost has to be recovered rather than needing to be reinvented. It's a very accessible and practical analysis of what the doctor's person and his or her art add to the therapeutic relationship. Much recommended. And we're almost out of time now, but I'm going to ask you one more question, Paul, and that's what if you were not necessarily if you were God, but if you were the healthcare minister or the people responsible for medical education, how might you what do you think in Western medical education needs to be changed or perhaps differently emphasized to address these sorts of questions and ensure that the doctors that we're popping out of our Western medical schools are people who know something of the art as well as the science of medicine? Are there books we should be reading?
You're trying to give me another opportunity for another shameless plug of my book is only very introductory. I like the sound of the other one that's just been mentioned, but certainly my book, in the slides, there is a link. If you click on that link, you'll find out how to get that from CMF UK. I think the simple thing that I would say, and again, I can't comment on how well this may already be being done in some contexts in medical education, but I think trying to explore the worldview philosophical. Somebody asked a question which we didn't get to, that in my definition, I talked about philosophy. I didn't mention religion. Yeah. And I should clarify, I'm by philosophy, I'm including, I think you can't separate those. I use the word philosophy because I think that is going to gain more acceptance in a so-called secular environment. But actually, you can't do that without getting into religious questions, because the big philosophical questions of ultimate reality inevitably lead you there. So I think there could be more done to at least help people understand that those worldview questions are foundational to why we do this, motivation, as well as how we do it, the ethics, as well as what it is that we're seeking to achieve, the sort of what is health, what is the end goal. You can't answer questions like that without values. So the biggest risk, I think, in the West, not only in healthcare, is the myth of value-free. Yes. Value-free education, value-free politics. It is a myth. There's always a value, and if you don't acknowledge that, that's more dangerous than at least opening up the space. So I'm not going to expect that healthcare in Europe can be reclaimed by the church. It was the church that pioneered it. You need to as someone mentioned, the nuns that became the nurses, the monks, I guess, who became the doctors, whatever, those religious things. That's where it came from. We can't reclaim that. We handed it over to the state, and we can ask whether they're doing a good job or not, but we can at least try to say that within that, it really matters that we know what we believe about bigger questions like what a person is. So I'm not saying that's the only thing. Maybe some more attention to the humanities, some more training and examining on the soft skills, the relational skills. But that foundation of saying, before you go into medical practice or healthcare, you must know what you believe about these big questions. I don't think Christians have anything to fear about that, but I think it might at least help us to have a healthier context where we can talk about religion and faith without people looking askance at you and saying, why are you even mentioning that in this place? This place isn't about that. It is, because this is about people. And so, yeah, that's what I would say. Let's weave that worldview foundation into medical education.
Great, and let's do it with confidence and with joy and with grace. Yeah. Paul, thank you so much. I've been listening to Dr. Paul Coulter on the art of healthcare today, and a very stimulating talk and discussion. May the Lord bless you. Thank you.